Okay, it looks like we are streaming. La-di-da, zippity-doo-da. Commence the light bulb. The analogical devices. Bygone era from when I was just a lad. Welcome to Evolution Hour and our Little Troubles in Paradise ongoing project of dissecting what the hell causes creationism to get so screwball and sundry other topics that come along as we go. As we all know, we are plowing through, almost nearing the end, of Titans, the creationist dinosaur book. Isn't it a pretty little picture? As we have shown before, they have good pictures. There's no doubt about their graphics are very nice. It's the content that's the problem. And this, golly gosh, is our 400th episode. Hello, Lisa. The Dems sold us out. Well, I'm not sure about that. The Democrats that I've seen seem to be going okay, but whether or not they've decided to end the shutdown is another matter. It all depends on what was or was not agreed to. The best solution to all of the mess that's caused by the Trumpistas is not to have Trumpistas in power, and that means you got to vote them out of office and have the Congress in the control of those again. So, hello, Vandalia. Anyway, our part one here is continuing in the chapter, one of the chapters they're trying to do to disconnect birds from dinosaurs. And they start off with kind of an end run, highlighting the mosaic nature of the platypus and critters like that, as if that made its monotreme taxonomical status and evolutionary clues go away. And in this thing, they try to do an end run, offering up a 2020 paper by Anich on the fact that there is traces of biofluorescent hair in that, and that's known from other mammals. It's not every single one, but and they're suspecting it may be adaptive, a trait for low light environments, but they're still not entirely sure because a lot of this stuff is just kind of diving into the element of things. S&T certainly didn't address their concluding question in that paper, which is biofluorescence an ancestral mammalian trait? Ta-da! Now, the Anich paper, as is often the case with stuff that creationists cite, they're often highly specialized technical works where evolution isn't really coming up as a main theme, even though it's hovering in the background. And this was a paper like that. But just because they weren't going into tremendous detail in discussing the evolutionary implications of this and what evolutionary work had been done on this doesn't mean there wasn't any. So I'll be putting some links up to a couple papers that will provide some context. One is from Ugaldi et al. From back in 2004 on the evolution of coral pigments recreated, as in working out the pathway to the green form that seems to be really kind of the one that pops up most and is apparently ancestral in a variety of groups, and the steps to get to it are quite incremental and relatively easy to do, as this paper was detailing. There's also ones that are in different wavelengths, like red, others, and those are regarded by the various literature as being derived forms. And that would come up with somebody who was a co-author on that Ugaldi paper, Mikhail Matz, who contributed to a 2010 paper, which I'll be putting the links up to, going into details on the molecules in the green form and the variant colors and where those variants are showing up in organisms. And so this is further indication that the biochemistry of it, at least, is kind of being pinned down in an awful lot of levels. The researchers, of course, not one of them creationists, have certainly kept at this, because even though biofluorescence has been known in organisms from like 1911 or so, they're not easily studied and often were not immediately obvious. So these newer papers have been coming along in the last decade or so, have kind of dived in to find out just how many there are and what's going on. New collab feature, but since I've had 500 something videos with more than one, I have to send invites for each one and each guest. Yes, I'm happy to be kind of a solo old fart on a solo channel all by myself, because it means not having to worry about gathering together material and cross-checking, showing screen shares and all this kind of complexity, which we were doing in the very early stages of the show. But as I've been devoting more and more of my attention to book writing and researching and pinning material down to keep abreast with the technical literature, it's easier and easier just to be the weekly talking head at this point. I'd be flabbergasted at the amount of effort that's required to do, and assistance that are required to do the much more sophisticated videos that Erica does, or Gutsick Gibbon and all the other, Dapper Dino and these others, who arrange with all sorts of meticulous background material for visual presentation, that it just takes more people than just lone wolf here. Anyway, back to our cute little material on the glowing issue. So there's a bunch of papers that I'll be putting up that'll give a little bit of a context. A 2021 Olson on the potential adaptability in nocturnal environments. And then the couple other papers are dealing with the issue of camouflage, whether that is coming up. That's still very much an up in the air thing. There's a 2022 paper, Sobral and Souza Goudenhau for rodents. And then there's a Travaillon et al. 2023, where they're going into about 125 species that they've found that are spread all across the mammal class that have these features, and trying to sort out how they're arising. And so, but two papers by Carr just this year, et al. 2025, which you'll be putting the links up to because they're both open access, on the repeated appearance and disappearance of biofluorescence in marine fishes and their likely adaptive role in reef environments, caught the ire of creationist Sarah Buckland Reynolds, who in earlier iterations was just Sarah Buckland. So apparently she's married in the meantime. And this is popping up at David Kopej's website, the Creation Evolution Info page. These two papers are really quite neat because they're filled with a lot of detail, but they Buckland can't stand the overall tenor of the thing. So they're basically rolling back on cliche. Her argument is a bunch of generic features. One is kind of an irreducible complexity argument, although she doesn't explicitly use that phrase. Said it's far too complicated. All of these things have to be linked together in specific ways. Well, the paper on the coral system with the green one suggested, no, it's not irreducibly complex. And then, of course, the whole idea that these molecules can't possibly have any preservation unless they're becoming a biofluorescent system misses the point. These are fairly common miscellaneous molecules, and they can exist in a non-fluorescent form, lurking around in places and then connect up in ways later on. Remember, we're talking about over hundreds of millions of years in varying lineages. And then once that happens, bingo, you have selection pressure to play off of the stuff. Anyway, Carr, of course, their papers are really going into great detail on laying out what the physical forensics are for these marine fish. And some of Carr just can't resist she doesn't address any of the actual substantive details of the paper. There's a couple of authority quotes she sticks up, which I found rather interesting in terms of what was being brought up and what wasn't. One particular quote that she came up with, where it's a fairly lengthy, I'll put up the thing because I had printed out the thing of the one from Nature Communications, the repeated and widespread evolution of biofluorescence in marine fishes. And it builds off of and relates these phenomena to some pre-existing phylogenetic work. That's from a paper by Ravlovsky in 2018, which was actually technically about speciation rates, but Carr drew on that for the phylogenetic framework. And that pissed our Buckland off because of these things are based on purely evolutionary assumptions. But the problem is not just based on just scattershot. They're dealing with morphology, they're dealing with genetics, they're dealing with the fossil record. In other words, the data, which of course is not something that we're getting from the creationist side. All they're doing is carping from the sideline. And then she also riffed off of a bioarchive preprint of a paper from Witcher et al. 2025, which eventually appeared at Nature, that I'll be putting the link to the finished version of it, on biofluorescence in frogs. So anybody that really want to kind of dive in to the fluff that's going on in Buckland compared to the substantive detail in those papers, plus the other ones that I'm putting links up, I think you'll be fascinated by all the little ins and outs of how they're trying to work out what species there are, what kind of formulations are happening, what phylogenetic signals about the fact that certain things that are dealing with red as opposed to green biofluorescence are indicating the sequence in which things are occurring in the evolutionary sequence. It's a delightful frame. Our part 2 is a delicious golden oldie that came about as a consequence of the work that I'm doing on Rocks for Their Volume 2, the cosmology chapter. And Johnson has to reopen the house. Yeah, that's going to be a funky, because then, of course, I assume he can't avoid swearing in that one new representative from California, which will probably be the swing vote to move forward on the Epstein files. So we're going to see what MAGA Mike can manage to do as we move into the next weeks. And then, of course, I'm still waiting for the stock market crash to upset everybody's economic circumstance. Whether AI is going to be the bubble that bursts first, or crypto, or both at the same time. It's entirely possible. They're both hideous energy hogs. Anyway, the part 2 relates to a trope that was way popular back in the day and has kind of faded a bit, and it relates to lunar dust. And the version that I had been familiar with was the ones from Henry Morris, Amazing Birth of Planet Earth, which actually I should go get that book. I forgot to bring that in. Let's see. There we go. Pardon moi for the brief maneuver. The where I had originally found it was from this silly little thing from 1972. This book was given out freebie from Jerry Falwell's bunch from an ad in TV Guide, which is how I got it for absolutely nothing. And it's a rip snorter, a kind of a condensed version of dumb, because it even has a section where Morris is offering, with a complete straight face, the idea that fissures and craters on the moon were actually coming about because of the battle between Satan and Archangel Michael back in the day. Sure, right. But anyway, the lunar dust thing pops up in this bit. And then in a somewhat revised version in his Scientific Creationism, which came out initially in 74 and then had a 1985 revision, and the version that I have is 1996. So the original argument turns out to have come from Harold Slusher in 1971, and I'll be putting a link up to his piece that he had initially put that in. And Henry Morris's version were kind of secondary elements. The 1972 book claimed, quote, "There is no measurable accumulation of meteoric dust on the Earth's surface, but present rates of influx of such dust from space would produce a layer 1/8 of an inch thick all over the Earth in 1,000,000 years, and a layer 54 feet thick in 5 billion years." And so presumably because there's no 54-foot layer of dust on the moon, therefore the moon can't be old. And there are little sidebars that have popped up with Don DeYoung in that, where they were chit-chatting about the lunar lander pads and how big they were, and it's a big sidebar. But the point is that the Slusher and the Morris 1974-1985 version finally inserted a source for it, which was a 1960 Scientific American article by Hans Pettersson, who was a researcher in meteoric dust. So, I mean, he was summarizing it for the general audience. Anyway, he had come up with a figure of 14 million tons per year, which Morris took to mean, quote, there should have been accumulated during the 5 billion year age of the Earth, a layer of meteoric dust approximately 182 feet thick all over the world, which varies from the 54 feet that he was talking about in the 1972 book. Now, to some extent, it's possible that he didn't inflate the value in just a couple years. He was conflating feet and meters, because 182 feet would be around 55 meters. So it was possible he was confusing English and metric, but that was way small on his error list compared to what we're about to get to this. Morris, in fact, in a 1974 post, not in his book, had contended that the opposite, that the influx of meteoric dust from space was too small to calculate. So if it was too small to even calculate, how is he making calculations on it? So he wasn't even consistent with his own argument. Anyway, despite critics who, by the 1980s version, had started poking holes in the whole meteoric dust claim, pointing out ultimately that dust was being accumulated up in the stratosphere and on mountaintops where Pettersson was taking his readings from, like in Hawaii. But the really fun part comes from the double down that Morris and Harold Slusher did. So, and it's Morris jumped the numbers up from that 14 million figure to 200 million tons annually for the Earth, and citing, quote, Hawkins 1976 for it. A 1985 letter by Slusher made exactly the same claim. And because those dates are suspiciously similar, it raises the possibility that either Morris was copying Hawkins or Slusher, or Morris was copying Slusher, or Slusher was copying Morris. And the reason why somebody was copying somebody is that Hawkins 1976 isn't from 1976. It's 1967. The dates have been transposed, but it gets even deeper. It was relating to a 1965 symposium, so no longer safe to fly them. Yeah, well, and some of them are the one that crashed airplane was the McDonnell Douglas that has a checkered track record of safety anyway, and of course is helping to drag Boeing down into a mess when they made their merger. But that's a sidebar. So when I had first noticed this from Morris's old book back in the 80s and 90s, I had a devil of a time trying to corroborate what the hell was going on. I even wrote a letter or emailed NASA to try to find out a little bit about it, because it's a NASA publication, but they didn't really have too much information available at that time either. So I was kind of stuck in a quandary. However, here we are in 2025, and it turns out the whole Hawkins volume was available via the Smithsonian as a full PDF. So la-di-da, I now had the original texts I could look at. And it turns out that not only, of course, is the thing from 1967, not from 1976, but none of the works in it were supporting that 200 figure. And so who was misunderstanding what? Turns out there were only two papers that were giving values on how much meteoric dust was coming as volume. And one gave 2.2 to 2.8 million tons, which was way below the 14 million. By the way, Pettersson, even in his article, had put a range of like 5 million to 14 million, and he suspected the 5 million was more appropriate. Well, Morris conveniently neglects to make use of that, and neither does Slusher. So they were immediately jacking it up to the high end of the thing. But these newer data were suggesting it was way lower than that. And the other paper, an even lower 300,000 figure, to make exactly the same mistakes about this 200 figure, 200 million, and the dating issue means that somebody, Slusher or Morris, was copying the other. One of them made the initial mistake, and the other was riffing off of it. The scholarship as to who was copying from who and who was coming up with who is a little bit vague in this area. No one's been able to pin it down, and so anybody's guess. Anyway, by 1996, the time of the edition of the newer book, Trump, oh yes, Trump is definitely much a loser, and unfortunately, so many of us are going to be losing with him. But that's the problems of having nincompoops in office. Anyway, research by 1996 it indicated that about a 20,000 ton figure was the most probable, and to add insult to injury, if Morris and or Slusher, the 200 million figure was actually accurate, it would blow to smithereens and other of Morris's tricks in that very section, which was trying to put boundaries on the age of the Earth via the ocean, via mineral content like nickel. So if the sea contains 3.5 billion tons of nickel, and terrestrial erosion is only contributing 375,000 tons a year, at the same time, meteoric dust is adding 200 million tons. By his own math, Morris would have just proven that the current amount took only 17 years to accumulate, which means that the Earth would have been created in 1957. What's wrong with this picture? Clearly, something had to be wrong. The influx rate might be wrong, as it turns out that's way too high of a number, 4 orders of magnitude too high, or the fact that meteoric dust, like a millionth of an inch, that's popping up on an annual basis ain't staying put, and it's getting washed down into the sea and getting subducted and put through into mountain ranges and not necessarily available elsewhere. As it turns out, Pettersson and the papers in these subsequent works are clearly indicating that the amount of nickel concentration that they're finding in rocks is well within the margins for error for what's coming down with meteoric dust. So that it's just literally a non-problem. Yes, my mom go Trump and Miller, Stinky and the Pain. Yes. Steve Miller is certainly one of the vampiric monsters in the Trump administration, and he is an absolute ideologue. And apparently, his wife is a battle axe too, with a similar ideology, just as Charlie Kirk's spouse had shares his ideology. I'll be 90 very soon. Well, then she's way old enough to remember the past that clearly Donald Trump has forgot, and apparently huge swaths of the Trumpista party are unaware of in terms of the history of things, including the stagflation of the 1970s and all the rest. So historical illiteracy is really going to be biting us for the next couple of years until we make some shifts, and presuming that we can still have fair elections. I can tell you that the Trump administration's grumbling about getting rid of mail-in voting. Washington State and Utah do 100% mail-in voting. We have no physical voting stations. We've had zero fraud and concerns here, and you just try to take away our mail-in ballots here. Give it a whack. What, are you going to try to keep me from putting my ballot in my little drop box up at the library? Hell no. So it's going to be very, very fun to try to figure all of that out. So what this meteoric dust example did as a really neat reminder of what scholarship means is that a thing that was very hard to check out back in the 1990s was effortless to deal with in the 21st century because the primary sources are available. So the vital issue is, can you get the original source material for a claim? And if so, look it up. When you're dealing with ideologues, don't take their word for any of it, and try to find stuff. It's no coincidence that the Trump administration is illustrating these very problems. Try spotting many instances of where people in the Trump administration are actively attempting to document their assertions. Trump certainly doesn't. He just pulls crap out of his thin air. Or he's copying people who tell him things, and the media don't particularly probe as to where he's getting his information from on matters. It would be useful from a source methods point of view to be able to isolate who's saying what to who's giving what recommendations based on what, and what source data is done. Of course, now that the Trump administration is becoming grumpy about any of the agencies giving accurate information on things like unemployment or inflation, Trump lives in his little bubble from his golden palace at Mar-a-Lago. There's no inflation. Everything is sweet and wonderful. And all the little people that surround him and tell him how fabulous and incredible he is are just happy to deal with that. And Lockjaw Besant, the Treasury Secretary, who was a big business failure, by the way, when he was involved in, I think, bond markets or insider trading or something back in the day. I mean, this is not exactly the crowd that inspires great confidence. And so the fact that so many million Trumpistas are inspired to confidence by these people indicate that they know very little about their background. Yeah, they know MAGA will never fact check him for 10 years. Faux news never did. Well, yes, and let me be charitable. It's that the news media are, by nature, as human beings, really not prone to do source methods analysis. This is a different issue from fact checking per se. They do fact checking. I mean, you can hear George Stephanopoulos probe J.D. Vance on things about false claims and all the rest. But source methods is beyond merely investigating whether the claim is true or not. Valid point. It's what sources does the person rely on for the false claim that they've just made? Are they inventing it out of thin air, which in some cases Trump is certainly capable of doing because he's a pathological liar. I mean, this is the Roy Cohn mode in him, that you just bullshit. You just make up numbers. And of course, some of the numbers he's making up are hilarious. He just pulls trillions of dollars out of the air. He pulls inflation rates out of the air. He pulls the amount of percentage that he can lower drug prices out of the air. Dr. Oz apparently has caught the disease. He's talking about the hundreds of billions of pounds, physical pounds, that are going to be lost by the American population because of their Ozempic price lowering, which may or may not ever happen. But the problem is, if you divide by the number of Americans, it means the average American is losing 390 pounds. Wow, that's interesting. If I lost that much, I would be negative. I wouldn't even, that would be like the 1,500% drop in the drug prices. So these people are just bandying numbers out in cloud cuckoo fantasy land. And spoiler alert, administrations that are basing their conclusions on faulty numbers and wishful thinking can't possibly be valid and desirable for policymaking. So there we go. Anyway, 26 minutes in, let me give a shout out, of course, to our patrons who have been helping us along the way, thick and thin, up and down, in and out over the various years. I appreciate enormously, and bear in mind, if you're in financial squibbles as to being able to help out, don't put me high on the priority list. If you can put me on the priority list and forward it comfortably, fine and dandy, but don't sacrifice circumstances. And bear in mind, things can get very, 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 very dicey in the months and years to come if my fears about what's going to be happening in the economy turn out to actually be accurate. Yes, it is very hard there's an awful lot of ass punditry going on in the Trump administration. And at least if you were quizzing Kamala Harris or somebody in the administration, in the previous administration, about stuff, there would be some allusions to things, and there would be material put up on websites. But I happen to notice when J.D. Vance, for example, was being pressed, and I think this was just before the election, about claims, or maybe it was after the election, because I think it was put up as he was now vice president. But anyway, he was making all these assertions about the immigrants and undocumented workers and how many jobs they would be taking and how much of an impact on welfare stuff there would be. And he promised that he would be putting up documentation for it. And his website put up 3 sources, which when I checked them, not one of them actually supported the claim he was making. They were all very generic discussions of other matters, and the points he was trying to raise were not in fact supported by that. So is J.D. Vance running on flat earth level bad source methods? Yeah, pretty much. And even though he went to Yale, did he ever learn sound methods there? Apparently not. Or it's politically expedient for him just to repeat tropes in a very confident voice and pretend like somebody is doing stuff. To get reporters to move into this mode of genuine source methods questioning is an important thing to do. And whether or not we can manage to instill this or not is quite a different kettle of fish, because human beings are terrible at that. I included the reflexive action when we are dealing with people who are saying counterfactual claims is to jump to the data floor and discuss what the facts are, not step back a bit and also probe where they're getting their source material from. And I've noticed in discussions that Forrest Volkai or Erica Gutsick-Gibbon or Dapper Dino or others will be doing when they're having discussions with creationists and the like on their venue, they're not typically probing on those points. So that often they're not getting the landscape of where that person's mind is coming from. In some cases, they may be coming from very superficial secondary sourcing. Other times, they might be relying on upper echelon bad information coming from like Answers Research Journal, things like that. But until you ask, you don't know. So Schrodinger's immigrants, they are lazy and will just suck off the welfare. Yeah, this of course is one of the long-standing tropes in anti-immigrant material. The lazy son of a bitches are coming here and taking all of our jobs. And this was the argument that was being made against Irish laborers back in the 19th century, and was the case with virtually every migrant group that's come in since xenophobes managed to go xenophobic. And it's no coincidence, if you look at it historically, that whenever we're trying to pull the plug on immigration, we tend to not produce economic prosperity overall. It's a bumpy ride having unrestricted immigration. As people get on the conveyor belt of labor and develop, they're often exploited. That was certainly the case in the 19th century. You could argue that the globalization approach was to exploit the migrant labor overseas rather than locally. And that's why anything involving free trade and the like needs to involve improving labor conditions for every worker everywhere, not just in the United States. So we're going to find out to some extent why we did have all of these reforms back in the 1890s, 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, and why we will need to do more or regroup on the ones that had already been made, because Vaught's meat axing of the safety net will have to be reconstituted in new forms. To some extent, a lot of the issues can be resolved by having a negative income tax system that will just eliminate the conventional welfare system and the like, but it will involve rich people actually paying more of their fair share, which they have been not doing for the last 25 years, since certainly Bush 2 came in office. So that's why we have all of these massive deficits, and Trump is, of course, racking still more massive deficits. It's going to be a mess for a lot of people, including when you start pissing off Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is crazy about the fact that their health insurance and her kids' health insurance are going to shoot through the roof because of these policies. That's showing you that red states are going to be affected just as much as blue states in this area, and maybe even more so, because we've got safety nets that we're keeping in place, and the red states don't have them at all. So it's going to be a fun and interesting time. Got my sense everyone else did too. Yes, I'm not sure. I know some people that are on Snap, and I'm be finding out whether or not they've been managed to getting anything. I suppose it all depends as well about electronic deposits versus other things. Then, of course, Trump supposedly, if they have to roll back their tariffs, are going to send us that $600 or whatever check for the tariff money. But that's just sending money from us to us. Meanwhile, Trump and his rich buddies are still raking in the stuff, and they're doing well. We're getting this K-shaped economy where a huge chunk of government or public spending, 40-50%, is just from those people in the top percentile. And that's not sustainable. That's not desirable. And all you have to do is to knock the props out from under things. I mean, just how many luxury things can the people at the top do? We know from the 1930s depression that an awful lot of luxury manufacturers faded away in that period, including the Duesenbergs. So my Virginia Bench, nowhere near cover my bill. Yeah, I'm able to still squeak along between Social Security and my book royalties, which continue to trickle in, and patrons. So we're squeaky. I've got to get a new fuel nozzle on the furnace. It stopped working, and now, but that will be presumably much less expensive than the fuel pump that I was afeared that it was going to be. But one thing leads to another. We move on as we go. So anyway, well past a half an hour. Let me put on our little advert for The Rocks Were There, Volume 1, which is a spectacular compendium, beautifully researched, deliciously funny, filled with just scads of information, not only on how effing stupid creationists can be, so it's worth a chuckle just for that, but also for the fact that the scientific information in there is actually dun, 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 educational and exciting. We live in a wonderful world of science today, and the more you know about it, the more neat it is, and the more stupid creationism looks. And we'll cut off there. How many have died of data in a SCAD? Well, it depends on whether you use the English SCAD or the metric SCAD. I believe it's 1/5 of a millihelen, which a millihelen being the amount of feminine beauty required to launch one ship. Then you have to convert that to either pumpkin pleasure or forgot the other half of the analogy on there. But anyway, pleased as pumpkins or some of the other things that don't have proper metrics. We need to have a proper calibration scale on that. So you convert your SCADs into pumpkin pleasure, and then from that into witch's tits. I'm not sure. That's a thermal measurement. So I'm not entirely sure how we can get out of this stuff. And given the claptrap coming out of the Trump administration, I think those measurement systems will be just as valid as what we're going to be getting out of them. It's going to be very interesting. When Trump repeatedly claims that inflation has ended, oh gosh, this guy doesn't get out much, does he? Besant apparently doesn't get out much there. The synchronous control asynchronous data flow processor. Yes. Well, I like to relate that to omni non-directionalism, which is my great philosophy of life. There's so many arguments against abolishing slavery. Yes. To be fair, it's extremely likely that way too many of the Trumpistas have a view of history that matches what they would be seeing in videos from PragerU. And that is not a happy place to be for knowledge. How many pink penguin nickels in that? Yes. That depends. And of course, remember, we have the optical properties of the pink penguins that call back to the subject of our report on the red biofluorescence. So actually, there are, I think, some birds in that have some of that little feature in that as well. So I think that maybe even some penguins that have that. So look in the papers that we have cited that will give some information on the subject. So anybody, everybody be safe on circumstances. If as we're dangling up into the holidays for travel and all that, be safe on that area with the icky weather that can occur. We're in kind of a little bit of a lull here. I got to find out what the passes will be like with when I'm going over to my niece and their bunch for Thanksgiving. That will depend on when I'm leaving here. We will have a backlog of programs all done up. So if you start seeing episodes then with different background than this, then you'll know, gosh, RJ's in Seattle. There we go. So educated only in private schools in red states. Yes. Well, even as I said, Vance went to Yale. There's quite a few of these people that have better education credentials than are indicated by what they're saying. Then you've got the other ones that are just flaming ideologues, Steve Bannon and that crowd. And even the degree element is irrelevant. I mean, you've got some doofus like Laura Loomer who's able to do veto actions on people in the Justice Department. I mean, this is just insane. But that's what happens when you give carte blanche to crazy people, and they're going to be doing crazy things. So Everybody stay super safe. Watch out for the laser wielding penguins guarding the ice wall down on the taco shaped flat earth. And we will all be checking you out again next week with another episode. There will be another Luskin episode next week. And we will continue to do this work as well as working on the chapters on the books. Got the degree because there's a building on campus with their family name. Yes, that's another one. When all these idiots that blither blather about pure meritocracy, okay, fine. Let's also get rid of set-asides for alumni students. And I think they tend to clam up on that front. But anyway, so everybody stay safe, and we will see you all next week.